So you've decided that now is the time to try Katalina. You've heard about the ridiculousness or you've seen the flashiness of this character. How do you play Katalina? Well, first and foremost, to be clear, this is definitely a character that has a higher skill ceiling. There's a lot of specific tech or hidden tech that you kind of need to learn, but I will be including a number of ways that you can maximize your damage, things that you should look out for, and pretty much things that you should be kind of looking for to make the best Katalina build that you can possibly build. Now, before I get any deeper with the guide, in case you just wanted to have a quick infographic or a quick guide as to how to play the character, I will be including an infographic tied to this video in the description, so feel free to skip to that or just use that if you want. I'll also be including a short or a guide to kind of explain briefly what you need to do or the things that you need to care about when it comes to playing Katalina properly. So first things first, let's talk about the weapon. As always, there isn't much debate on whether or not the Terminus weapon is the best because ultimately it gives you damage cap and it gives you everything. You kind of get the idea. But something that I've kind of seen go back and forth about whether or not it's worth it or not worth it is whether you should actually just keep Luminera, the Sword Omega, aka the critical hit rate and the critical hit damage weapon, or if you should actually upgrade the Ascension weapon, get that extra damage cap initially, and have to invest some resources early just so you can beat up Bahamut faster. Long story short though, it's pretty much preference. If you don't want to venture online to see if you can find people that have better weapons with Proto Bahamut and they can kind of clear you through or beat the content easier for you, you probably will end up needing to awaken your weapon or play much better with the critical hit rate and critical damage weapon. That being said though, guys, it's not that big a deal if you want to upgrade all these weapons because outside of the awakening, you're going to need to 150 all of these weapons in order to get the max masteries anyways. Okay, now here's kind of the interesting thing about Katalina's skills. I am going to go a little bit out of order just in terms of what I think is kind of important. And the first thing that I do kind of think is important here is actually Azure Sword. Summons Ares to attack foes in front of Katalina and temporarily maxes out the Ares gauge. Now, if you're familiar with Katalina's game plan, just in general, what you're trying to do is get Ares out and all of your skills, your damage, your heavy attack, everything gets enhanced once Ares is out on the field. And in scenarios where you don't want to have to build up too much of a combo or have to do a bunch of things to build up your gauge to then get Ares unlocked, Azure Sword is a great kind of cheat. Skip the line, get Ares out instantly, and then kind of do your damage if the skill is not on cooldown. There are definitely arguments to be made about the skills that you may trade out for something like an evasion skill or something for defensives or something for a crowd control. And Azure Sword, technically speaking, if you're really good at activating your combo, is one of these skills that you could potentially change, but ultimately just given how much flexibility you have and how easy it is to get into the Ares spamming phase of your DPS rotation, specifically with the skill, 99.99% of the time, I would not recommend getting rid of the skill. Okay, so the next skill that we have is Frozen Blade, and although there are a couple of characters in the game that have really interesting or very impactful range skills while still being melee, Katalina actually utilizes this skill very well because it lets you prolong Ares' gauge, especially if you're not trying to do one of the tricks that allows you to keep Ares up 24/7. More on that later though. And although I did kind of hype up the skill to be pretty good because again, you have 2 charges of it and that lets you prolong how long Ares stays on the field, this is actually the skill that if you want to get crowd control, if you want to add Glaciate, Sacred Wind, etc., you would probably give up this skill so that you can bypass phases, deal more damage, coordinate with the team, etc. And again, the way that this skill works is that you throw out a ranged attack and you do have 2 charges, which again does let you prolong Ares a little bit longer, but the damage is not as important compared to some of the other skills or just spamming your heavy attack when Ares is out. So in general, if you want crowd control, remove this skill. Winter Rain is kind of your bread and butter when it comes to damage alongside your heavy attacks, just because this skill not only gives you a decent amount of stun, it also does pretty good damage. There isn't really much to say about this skill in all honesty. There are a couple of skills that in every single Granblue character's, I guess, kit, they're pretty much just the damage skill. It leads into a combo finisher. It's kind of your damage filler that does a lot of damage, assuming that you have skill up or max damage cap. Because of how well it pairs into the combo booster as well, and the fact that, as it reads here, it provides you a decent amount of stun power. This is pretty much a mainstay skill that you likely won't be changing that often, unless again you want to just try out something different. But the last and final skill that I also think is pretty important and pretty much a non-negotiable in terms of whether or not you keep it is Enchanted Lands. Now I will go a little bit more in depth with it once I get to sigils, but I do want to make a warning that although this is a decent skill that does decent damage, this is one of the most difficult and most ridiculous scaling skills I've ever seen in terms of trying to hit damage cap. If you can believe it or not, it is actually more difficult to cap damage on this specific skill than it is to actually cap on your SBA gauge skill, which is absolutely mind-blowing because a lot of people can run stuff like Combo Booster, they can have stuff like Stamina and Tyranny all in the same build and still not cap SBA. If you try to do the same math and see how close you are to capping with enchanted lands, you are never going to pretty much go above 50% cap, which is already an insane number to hit for cap in terms of how much damage you could get from this ability. On average, with all damage sigils and things like that, you are averaging anywhere between 15 to 30% potential damage cap on this skill. In other words, it's kind of not worth it to try and skill cap this skill, especially since you're going to overcap all your other damage skills by upwards of 80, 90, even maybe 100% in order to get 30, 40, 50% on enchanted lands. On the topic of skills, damage, and caps, let's talk about her masteries. Now, the interesting thing about this character is that unlike other characters where you may end up wanting something like SBA damage, or you might want flat attack to sort of cap, this character can actually gain a lot just from giving yourself skill damage up, which is actually a stark contrast to most characters which will accept something like normal cap damage, crit, and also just skill up damage in general because they probably hit the cap. But unlike these other characters like Katalina or Vasaraga actually need a lot of help either through their masteries or by using stuff like combo booster to even cap out some of their skills. What you're actually looking for is critical hit rate, normal attack damage cap up, either again SBA damage or skill damage up, and then something like a skill damage cap up if you really want to unlock the potential of your other skills, which I guess will technically also widen the gap between you actually being able to cap your enchanted lands and like where you are originally. Long story short, it's pretty much the same as every other damage build, but you can also slot into skill damage if you want to try and hit the damage cap on your skills. Okay, now Katalina is another kind of interesting case when it comes to sigils, primarily because, like I mentioned before, it is kind of difficult to cap on skills. Formerly, my guide on Lancelot was kind of nice in terms of building him, just because he has pretty low damage cap ceilings. So for most cases, especially if you weren't using flight over fight, all you would need to do is pretty much just have stamina and tyranny and you'd hit the cap. But for Katalina, you actually do kind of need to fit a stamina, a tyranny, and a combo booster if you want to max out how much damage potential you can have. That being said though, if you want to forego something like the final combo booster, just keep stamina and tyranny and give yourself something like stout heart and steel nerves just so you can kind of ignore boss mechanics and also not get one shot. It is worth mentioning that this is a pretty viable way to play as well. Now you could argue that you don't need stout heart, but in all honesty, since you actually lose Ares or Ares despawns if you dodge at any point, it kind of makes more sense for you to have stout heart so that in case you want to just kind of chug through or power through a hit and kind of just potion through it, this allows you to do that. Now, of course, this doesn't excuse you from getting one shot, so keep that in mind. But again, in general, stout heart is really, really strong because it doesn't let foes interrupt you. And ultimately, that's kind of the name of the game, especially when you don't have access or you aren't as inclined to start dodging or rolling. Outside of this, we can talk about the right stone and kind of the different sigils that I have. I have a right stone with 10 crit, which is really important because it lets me hit the 100 crit rate. But then something that I also think is kind of important, especially with characters that are melee and get a lot of hits off, is actually managing to find a right stone that not only has crit, but also has cascade. The 3 critical hit damage here doesn't really do much for me, but in terms of everything else that I have, it's reach your damage cap, and for me, I find it easiest to do this through stamina and tyranny. Combo booster is also obviously ideal if you can afford it, but it's not actually that easy to fit all the things that I have on screen here. You'd probably have to give up like something like one of your traits, or you'd have to give up something like stout heart. Again, I prefer the crowd control immunity or not being able to get interrupted by the boss. A lot of the bosses move around anyways, which makes it equally as annoying. So for me, what I like to do is, again, we'll get into a little later, I like to do a little bit of the Ares dropping tricks or the Ares like stalling tricks so that I don't have to do any rolling and kind of just move along with the boss. But aside from that, very typical, you have supplementary damage, you have war elemental, and then sigil booster is usually more than enough to compensate for any missing traits or anything that you're missing otherwise. If you were for some reason going to give up one of the traits, I don't know if I would really recommend it. Now again, decreasing Katalina's skill cooldowns when Ares is summoned, pretty invaluable, obviously because you want to be able to use your skills, your dashes, your stuns, etc. And with Guardian's Conviction, you can't really give up supplementary damage, especially when supplementary damage is kind of the name of the game. And finally, if you're wondering if you could take away or get rid of a steel nerves, you kind of can't, because again, this is a secondary or this is not a damage sigil, and what you would honestly be looking for is another damage sigil or trait to kind of give you more damage. But again, I don't really have anything, or I don't really have any more room for it in my build. Maybe you guys can find the room for it though. Let me know in the comment section below. Now, before we go any further, I do want to address something that I was kind of talking about earlier about dropping Ares or maintaining Ares uptime. And essentially what I'm referring to is the blue knight that spawns that increases your damage and kind of revolves or is kind of the main revolving gameplay aspect when it comes to Katalina. Now, if you've read any of Katalina's skills even for a moment, you'll see that a lot of her skills reads deals more hits or deals more damage when attacking with Ares. And so therefore Ares, or maintaining Ares or keeping Ares on the battlefield, is extremely important. Now I am going to go into the exact gameplay loop and again what exactly you should be doing and kind of the tricks that I use to keep him on the field. But to refresh your memory before we get into it, dodging drops Ares or forces him to despawn. If you miss or take too much time in between your attacks or any of your abilities while you're fighting with Ares, that also despawns him. And the very obvious one, if you end up getting one shot or you end up getting downed, he also just disappears off the field. Okay, now again, to be clear, the general game plan when it comes to looping and the general gameplay loop that you're going to play when it comes to Katalina is again keeping Ares out. So as you can see here, when you press 4, he does a bit of an attack and he also shows up, but after a few seconds, if nothing has been queued up, he disappears. So again, if you're curious, something you can do if you want to prevent how long the initial startup is for Azure Sword, you can actually dodge straight out of it. There is a faster way of doing it, but for me, I actually do like, again, dodging towards the enemy, or I do like dodging in general. And again, this lets you continue the string, and that's kind of what will set off all your Ares skills, and you don't really have to worry too much about whether or not Ares is going to stay alive. Now, if you take a look at a clip here, I will explain what's basically going on, and that's that there is an Ares uptime trick, where essentially once you have Ares out, all that you have to do is continue your heavy attack. At the end of one of your heavy attacks, when you swing into the air with Ares and it looks like you're about to come down, and you would normally do something like your pack strike or prolong the combo, what you actually do is let your combo drop, and what you instead do is let yourself fall from the ground, and what you instead try to do is an attack into a lunge. Now, to be clear, the comboing of this and the inputs are really precise, but if you do it properly, what you'll see is you can actually just keep Ares up permanently, because the final input that you register doesn't technically count as an input, or it allows you to just prolong and it considers it another combo. It is a bit complex, and I will link in the description a couple of the other videos or the guides that I've seen about how to prolong Katalina's combo. Long story short though, make sure to keep some of these Ares uptime tricks in mind, because ultimately that is the difference between someone that is doing 30 million damage on Katalina and someone that is only doing something like 20. Something that you could also implement into your game plan, although is kind of goofy and kind of jank depending on what kind of fight you're doing, is that actually the skill Winter Rain can be canceled quite early, and you could actually do a little bit of a hop or a bit of a dash and not have your Winter Rain skill go on cooldown. As you can see with the Winter Rain, if you cancel it just in time, it doesn't actually go on cooldown, and it does actually give you a little bit of a boost. Now, ultimately, guys, there are like 1,000 different things that you can do to increase the damage cap of certain things. Like you could have Pack Strike be canceled by Link strikes or Link attacks, and then have the damage cap of certain skills be transferred onto other skills. But a lot of that is very situational, and it is very dependent on the boss, the execution, and whether or not you can even find a place for that to happen in a fight. But with everything that I've shown you guys today with Katalina, you should have a very good grasp of how to play the character. And ultimately, I hope to see more of you guys online, because honestly, I really like the Glaciate. I really like the way that the character looks. And honestly, it also helps that she does, pretty good damage if you know how to play her. That is going to be it for this video, though, guys. I hope you enjoyed or you learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn the notification bell, subscribe. Let me know what you think about the kind of guide structure of this. If you think anything should get changed. If I mispronounce another character, because honestly, that does happen sometimes. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure to check out the rest of my socials. I stream this game both on Twitch and YouTube, so if you're curious about seeing what's up, or if you have any questions for me, feel free to ask questions there as well. I'll see you guys on the next one. I'll see you all on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Adios.